New York. The 19th of April 1989. The city glowed like a giant, sleepless beast, roaring with honking horns, neon lights, and the hot breath of millions of people crowding every street corner. But right at its heart, Central Park, a cold darkness opened its mouth to swallow every familiar sound. The wind blew through the trees like a warning that no one could understand. That night, the fates of five boys' children still learning to find their place in the big world were bent in ways no one could imagine. Yusef Salam, 15, stood in front of his apartment building hearing his friends call out from the park. He had no idea that his carefree footsteps were heading toward an abyss that would cast a shadow over his entire life. Kevin Richardson, 14, kicks a can of soda in the street, unconsciously approaching the moment that will define his youth. Antron McCrae, who has just left home, worried about his father scolding him, has no idea that his fear is smaller than all that awaits him. Raymond Santana Quick, smiling, thinks the friends in the park will help him escape the suffocating atmosphere of the neighborhood. And Corey Wise, the only one who didn't make an appointment, didn't plan to go, just came to support a friend. But he's facing the longest, darkest nights the city has ever known. None of the five kids know that. Just a few hundred meters away, a shocking crime is taking place. A female jogger has been brutally attacked in the dark, beaten, left in the bushes, gasping for breath, as if evil has just covered the entire park in a chilling fog. And in that terrifying moment, the city's anger, media hysteria, and political pressure created an invisible net, tightening around the five innocent boys. Police sirens tore through the air. Red and blue lights cut through the streets like slashes. Children's hands were tied behind their backs. The relentless questioning, the suspicious eyes, the cold interrogation rooms, all of it turned five children into five monsters in one night. Before anyone could ask, "Where is the truth?" That was the night justice closed its eyes. That was the night five children were robbed of their childhoods. And that was also the night a journey of survival began, a real tragedy, where pain, injustice, and hope intersected to form a story that has rocked America for more than 30 years. On the night of the 19th of April 1989, the sky over New York was covered in a thick black as if someone had stirred it with an invisible anxiety. Central Park was like a giant maze, where the rare lights only illuminated a few patches of winding roads. The whole city seemed to be keeping silent before an unexpected event. In that night, a series of small choices, careless footsteps, seemingly harmless conversations, all blended into a terrifying storm that swept away five boys whose lives would never be the same again. But it was from this darkness that they would learn to stand up, to fight, to find themselves again, and become symbols of hope, something they could not even imagine at that moment. Yusef Salam stood on the steps of his apartment building, his hands in the pockets of his thin coat, his eyes watching the cars speeding down the avenue like red streaks of light. He was 15. A real kid. A little taller than his friends, but with a voice that still trembled when he spoke to adults. His mother had told him over and over again, "Stay close, Yusef. Don't wander around when it's dark." But he didn't care. New York boys grew up surrounded by honking cars, hip-hop music from record stores, loud laughter from their friends. They weren't afraid of the dark. Central Park was just a wide-open space to run around, to talk about random things, to feel a little freer than the narrowness of Harlem allowed. Not far away, Kevin Richardson, the smallest of the group, only 14, was kicking an empty soda can as it rolled across the pavement. Each sharp kick made him feel like he was playing something bigger, more fun, though he was still a little nervous as the night fell. He knew his mother didn't like him going out. But that was 14. Half child, half adult, half wanting to listen, half wanting to test his limits. When he heard his friends say they were gathering in the park, Kevin rushed off, not thinking, not knowing that his life was about to take a turn that would never come back. Antron McCrae was clutching his baseball jacket, wondering if his father would be angry if he came home late tonight. Antron was a sensitive child, always trying to do the right thing, always wanting his father to be pleased. Because Antron's father was the type of person with principles that sometimes made the whole family suffocate. But tonight, he wanted to escape that feeling, even if only for a little bit. Central Park and his friends, the laughter, the excitement, all of it made him feel like he was living his own life, even if only temporarily. Raymond Santana was someone who never sat still. He was hot-tempered, wanderlust-prone, loud-mouthed, sometimes a little mischievous, but never malicious. At 14, Raymond wanted only one thing: the feeling of belonging to a group of friends. And tonight, that group was in Central Park. What else could he think about? Corey Wise, the oldest of them, 16, had not exactly planned to go to the park that night. He had just wanted to see his girlfriend, a shy 6-year-old in love, simply wanting to see the person he liked. But fate has a way of pulling people away from the most ordinary plans, just by a few random encounters. Corey had no idea that by turning left instead of right, by following his friends instead of going straight home, he would become the one who suffered the most out of the five. But fate never gives warning. By the time the five boys, each from a different part of the city, finally converged on the leafy part of Central Park, the air had begun to thicken with something ominous. Some of the older boys were yelling, chasing passers-by, throwing rocks into the pond, doing the stupid things boys do when they get excited. The five boys stood on the edge, watching without joining in. Deep down, they all knew the chaos in the park tonight was not a good thing. But they were too young to know that there were moments when they had to leave immediately, at all costs. Too young to understand that sometimes just being in the right place at the wrong time could ruin a life. The time that followed seemed to be cut off from each boy's memory. Running figures, screaming voices, and then the police appeared as if from the sky. And then, on the other side of the park, a horrific crime occurred. A female jogger was brutally attacked, beaten, raped, and left gasping for breath in the bushes. When the police found her, they were shocked by the inhumane level of violence. She was thought to be dead, and at that moment, a thought crossed the minds of several investigating officers: find the killer immediately. But instead of looking for the real culprit, they looked toward the group of teenagers who had just been brought in to be worked on. A group of Black and Latino boys, young, poor, legally ignorant, without lawyers, without adults to protect them at that moment. These children had become the perfect sacrifice for an angry and panicked city. In the cold, metallic interrogation room, Kevin Richardson sat huddled, his hands clenched. He didn't understand what was happening. The police kept asking him questions, going around and around, telling him that his friends had confessed, that he should cooperate or he would get into trouble. They scared him, the instinctive fear of a child who knew he was trapped in an adult world with no one there on his side. Everything in Kevin's head was spinning like the sirens outside. He began to think, should I say what they want to hear to get home? Little did he know that those words would turn into evidence that would bind his life. Yusef Salam was silent. He tried to stay calm, but the anxiety in his heart made his heart pound so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. His mother was outside arguing with the police to get in to see him, but they were using every excuse to stall for time. All the questions, the cutting words, the subtle threats, all made Yusef feel like he was shrinking, so small that he was left with nothing but despair, waiting in front of a locked door. Antron McCrae, unlike the others, had a haunting feeling deep in his heart. The fear of disappointing his father. When the police told him that his father had advised him to cooperate, Antron felt everything fall apart. The police knew how to exploit his weakness. And he, wanting his father to believe that he was not a bad kid, wanting the right thing in the most innocent way, agreed to confess to things he had not done. Corey Wise, the only one not initially suspected, was actually only at the police station because he was with a friend. If Corey hadn't gone in that night to support Yusef, his life might have been different, but his friendship kept him going. And that's what landed him the longest sentence: 13 years, most of it in adult prison. During his interrogation, Corey had no mother, no one to explain. He spent hours being probed by investigators, as if they were digging into every dark corner of his mind, looking for a crack. And when they found one, everything fell apart. Raymond Santana was so scared, he barely knew what he was saying. He just wanted to go home. Just to escape the interrogation room that had become a box that swallowed his breath. When the police told him that his friends had accused him, when they had told everyone else the same thing, Raymond panicked. His eyes reddened, his voice trembled, and he finally confessed in the hope of being released. But that confession was his first sentence. When the 5 forced confessions were given, they all contradicted each other. did not match any details of the crime scene, and even completely misrepresented the location of the crime. But to an angry city, the confessions of the children were no longer the truth. They became weapons. They became stories to quench the thirst of the press for information. They became walls to prevent people from seeing the real culprit. The subsequent trial was like a giant stage where the 5 children were presented as monsters. Their innocent faces became the focus of hatred. They were convicted based on the only thing that should not be considered evidence: forced confessions. When the judge hammered down the gavel to pronounce the sentence, each of them felt like their lives were being torn in two. None of them understood the meaning of the years of imprisonment they would have to endure. But they knew one thing: their childhood was over. In the years that followed, each of them drifted into a different prison. It was not a place for children, but a cold concrete prison, where violence, fear, and loneliness were their only companions. But it was there, in the pitch-black night, in the seemingly endless days, that each boy would discover a strength they had not known they had, a strength that would keep them alive, a strength that would keep them from being crushed by injustice. And later, it would be that strength that would make them rise from the ashes, tellers of the story. So the world would never forget that justice sometimes sleeps, but truth does not. The first nights in the juvenile facilities felt like falling down an endless shaft of cold air, the kind that steals your breath even before you hit the bottom. For Kevin Richardson, the cell door clanging shut behind him made the whole room vibrate, as if the concrete itself was trembling with him. He sat on the thin mattress, arms wrapped around his knees, trying to understand how the world he knew had been swapped for this place, this echoing, metallic tomb where every sound seemed like a warning. There was a flickering light above his head, buzzing in a rhythm that made the silence even louder. Kevin kept hearing his mother's voice, soft and warm, calling him my baby, telling him to come home before dark. But he hadn't come home. He was here. And he didn't know when or if he would ever see that living room again. Raymond Santana tried to act tough the first few days. He had always been the one who walked a little faster, talked a little louder, laughed a little harder to hide the anxiety swirling inside. But in the cell, alone, the facade peeled off like old paint. Raymond felt the weight of 1,000 judgments suffocating him, the faces of reporters shouting outside the courthouse, the whispers of guards, the sneers of older inmates who looked at him like prey. He gritted his teeth at night, refusing to cry even when the tears burned behind his eyes. His father's voice echoed in his mind, the disappointment, the exhaustion, the fear that had slipped through in moments he thought Raymond wasn't paying attention. "I raised you better than this," his father had said, not knowing his son had done nothing wrong. Those words dug into Raymond deeper than any sentence ever could. Antron McCrae's thoughts were darker. His world had always revolved around approval, especially from his father. But now, in the steel-blue isolation of his cell, Antron realized something had shattered between them. His father had told him to confess. His father, the man he had always trusted, had unknowingly pushed him off a cliff. Antron replayed that moment in the interrogation room over and over. The way the detectives kept glancing at his father, the subtle pressure, the shift in the room's atmosphere. Once his father said, "Just tell them what they want." Antron had trusted that voice, and now he carried the guilt of that trust like a stone pressed into his chest. Every night he whispered apologies into the darkness, not even sure who he was apologizing to: himself, his father, or the child he used to be before the world stole him. Yusef Salam, meanwhile, had something the others didn't. He had faith, not a blind, comfortable faith, but the kind forged through pain and uncertainty. Even as the walls closed in around him, as guards looked at him like he was a criminal rather than a child, as nights stretched long and cold, Yusef found solace in whispered prayers. His mother's strength lived inside him like a flame that refused to be extinguished. He remembered her fighting to see him, yelling at officers, refusing to be intimidated. That image anchored him when everything else seemed to drift away. Sometimes he imagined she was in the room with him, sitting beside him, smoothing his hair like when he was small. In those moments he felt like, maybe, just maybe, he could survive this. But Corey's journey was different. Harsher, crueler, more unforgiving. Because Corey, being 16, had been sent to an adult prison, a place where hope felt like a foreign language. On his first night, he heard screams echoing down the hallway, the kind of screams that scrape against the bones. Corey pressed his back to the wall, trying to become smaller, trying to disappear. The guards walked past him, without looking into his eyes, as if he was already invisible. The inmates stared with a mix of hunger and hatred. Corey wasn't supposed to be here. He was just a boy. But in the world behind bars, nobody cared what someone was supposed to be. Days blurred together. Corey barely slept, always listening for footsteps approaching his cell, always bracing for the worst. He got into fights not because he wanted to, but because not fighting was even more dangerous. Every bruise on his ribs, every cut on his lip, every swollen knuckle made him feel less like a person and more like a creature struggling to survive in a jungle built out of steel. Sometimes, when he could barely stand, he wondered if the universe had made a mistake placing him on this earth at all. Yet, even in the darkest corners of the prison, Corey held on to something fragile but powerful: the belief that the truth would eventually break through. He didn't know when, he didn't know how, but he clung to it because letting go meant letting the system swallow him whole. And Corey Wise was not ready to let that happen. Time moved differently for each of the boys. Weeks became months. Months became years, each carrying its own kind of torture. Kevin learned to keep his head down, to avoid eye contact, to move quickly but quietly. He found small pockets of safety: a guard who wasn't cruel, an older inmate who nodded respectfully instead of threateningly. Sometimes Kevin found solace in drawing. He would sketch the outline of Central Park from memory, though now the trees seemed twisted, the pathways darker. But still, drawing kept his hands steady, kept his mind focused on something that belonged to him. Raymond found himself drifting into thoughts of what could have been. If he had gone home earlier, if he hadn't stopped to talk to the older boys that night, if the police had listened, if the world didn't see his skin color before it saw his innocence. Those thoughts pierced him like needles. But they also fueled him. He vowed silently, over and over, that when he got out, he wouldn't let this system define him. But then, sometimes, he wondered if that was even possible. How do you rewrite a story that the world has already printed in permanent ink? Antron struggled the most with his identity. He didn't know who he was anymore. He wasn't the honor roll student. He wasn't the obedient son. He wasn't even the friend he used to be. He felt hollowed out, stripped of childhood, stripped of trust. Some days he woke up angry at everything: at the guards, at the other inmates, at the police, at the jogger, at the universe. But then there were other days when he felt nothing at all, like a numb ghost walking through hallways that no longer seemed real. The only thing that kept him tethered to reality was the thought that maybe, one day, he would be able to tell the world who he really was. Not the monster the newspapers had painted, but a child who had been wronged. Yusuf, with his quiet resilience, grew stronger in a different way. He read books, philosophy, spirituality, poetry. He wrote letters to himself, letters he never sent, letters filled with questions and fears, and the occasional flicker of hope. He learned that strength wasn't about having control. It was about enduring when control was stripped away. Sometimes guards mocked him for praying. Sometimes other inmates laughed at him. But Yusuf didn't care. He felt guided by something bigger. Something that whispered through the bars and reminded him that truth has a way of breaking chains, even if it takes a long, long time. But Corey Corus' suffering became the soul of the tragedy. In adult prison, he endured beatings, solitary confinement, starvation, mockery, despair so deep it threatened to swallow him. Yet he found strange moments of humanity in unlikely places. A guard who slipped him extra food after a particularly brutal attack, an inmate who offered advice instead of threats, a chaplain who treated him like a human being rather than a number. These moments were small, but they mattered. They reminded Corey that even in a broken system, compassion sometimes leaked through the cracks. Years passed. The world outside moved on: new headlines, new scandals, new tragedies. But for the five boys, now young men, time moved like molasses. Every day was a reminder of the injustice carved into their lives. Every night was a battle against despair. And then, nearly 13 years after that night in the park, a miracle happened. The truth walked into the prison wearing handcuffs. Matias Reyes, the real attacker, a serial rapist and murderer, confessed, not because he wanted fame, not because he wanted anything, but because he had found religion, found remorse, found a reason to admit what he had done. He confessed in detail, with accuracy, with evidence. DNA confirmed it. Timeline confirmed it. His story matched reality in every way the boy's coerced confessions never had. When the justice system finally admitted its mistake, it was a quiet moment. No fanfare, no public apology, just paperwork, signatures, cold words like vacated convictions. But for the five, it was everything. Kevin cried when he heard the news. Not gentle tears, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place he had locked away for years. Raymond clenched his fists and whispered, "Finally." He wasn't sure whether he wanted to shout or collapse. Antron fell to his knees. He didn't know if he believed in miracles, but this felt like one. Yusef closed his eyes and thanked God. And Corey sat in silence for a long time, as if the air around him had become sacred. He had entered prison as a boy. He was leaving as a man carved from pain and endurance. But freedom was not the end. Freedom was the beginning of the hardest part. Rebuilding. The world did not hand them their lives back. They had to recreate themselves from the ashes. They had to learn how to breathe again, how to trust again, how to live again. Yet through all of it, one thing became clear. They were no longer victims. They were survivors. They were brothers in a story that would one day inspire millions. A story of injustice. A story of resilience. A story of truth refusing to die. And their journey, the journey toward becoming symbols of hope, was only just beginning. Freedom did not come with a sunrise. It came with a paper. A simple sheet, held in the hands of men who had been denied their childhoods. When the judge read the words that vacated their convictions, the air felt too still, too fragile. As if the world itself was trying to understand what had just happened. For years, their names had been chained to a lie. Now the chains were gone, but the marks remained. Kevin Richardson stepped out of the courthouse and felt the wind hit his face like a memory he had almost forgotten. Real wind, not recycled prison air that tasted of rust and despair. He inhaled deeply and found himself trembling, not from fear this time, but from something new, something like relief. But mixed with a grief so heavy it felt almost physical. His sister hugged him first, her arms wrapping around him with all the years she couldn't. Kevin clung to her, feeling the warmth of a life that had continued without him. Behind them, cameras clicked. Reporters shouted. People leaned in to see the faces of the men they once condemned. But Kevin didn't listen. His focus was on the way the sky looked. He whispered to himself, "I'm home," as if saying it aloud would make it real. Raymond Santana walked out with a rigid posture, almost like a soldier returning from war. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp, cautious. Years inside had taught him that danger could hide anywhere. But as he stepped into the open air, something in him cracked. His father was there, older, grayer, more tired, but there. When their eyes met, Raymond felt the resentment, the hurt, the anger he had carried for so long rise up in him like a wave. But then his father's eyes filled with tears, and suddenly all those years of silence were replaced with one moment of truth. "I'm sorry, son," the man said, his voice breaking. Raymond didn't know how to answer. He just leaned forward and let his father hold him. Not ready to forgive, but willing to begin. Antron McCrae couldn't bring himself to look anyone in the eye. The world outside felt too bright, too loud. Reporters pushed microphones toward him, asking how he felt, what he would do now, whether he was angry. Antron wanted to scream. He wanted to run away, but his mother put a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. She whispered, "You're safe now, baby." For a second, Antron let himself believe her. He nodded, though his heart felt stitched together with too many broken pieces. Freedom, for him, wasn't joy, it was adjustment, a return to a world he no longer recognized. Yusef Salam came out standing tall. Not arrogant, not defiant, just present. Whole. He had prayed for this moment so many nights he could recite the feeling by heart. When he saw his mother, he bowed his head into her embrace. The woman who had fought the system with a ferocity the city had underestimated. She kissed his forehead and said, "I told them they couldn't break you." Yusef closed his eyes. letting her words sink into the cracks of his spirit. He had survived because he held on to something no prison could steal: his sense of purpose, even if he hadn't yet discovered what that purpose was. But Corey emerged from prison last. The others had been released earlier, after their sentences ended. But Corey had served the longest, the hardest, and he had waited years after the others were free before his truth was finally recognized. When he stepped into freedom, it was not the courthouse steps he walked down, but the prison gate. The guards opened it with the same mechanical indifference they used for every inmate, as if they weren't releasing a man who had been wronged by an entire system. Corey walked slowly, almost afraid the ground outside would vanish if he moved too quickly. The sunlight hit him like a slap, too bright, too raw. He blinked, squinting at the horizon. No reporters, no crowd. Just silence. For a moment, Corey felt like crying, but the tears wouldn't come. The years had trained his body not to cry, not to show vulnerability. But when he saw his mother's car parked a few feet away, engine off, door already opened, something inside him loosened. She came toward him in small, trembling steps, as if afraid he would disappear. When she finally reached him, she wrapped her arms around him with the desperate tenderness of a mother who had been grieving while her son was still alive. "Let's go home," she whispered. "Home!" The word felt foreign. But Corey nodded, because whatever came next, he knew he had to try. The reunion was only the beginning. The world had changed in ways none of them could have imagined. Technology raced ahead, neighborhoods transformed, people aged, lives continued without them. The five men walked into a world that expected them to be whole when they had been shattered. Kevin tried to find work. He filled out applications, marked yes on the question about prior convictions, even though those convictions were now overturned. Some employers nodded politely. Others frowned. Some didn't respond at all. Weeks passed. Kevin's confidence, already fragile, began to crack. He looked in the mirror one night and whispered, "What am I supposed to be now?" But then his sister walked in, placed a violin case in front of him, the instrument he had loved as a boy before the world stole his music, and said, "Start with this." Kevin picked up the violin. His hands trembled. The first note was rough, broken, but the second note was stronger, and slowly, painfully, music returned to his life, becoming the bridge between the boy he was and the man he was becoming. Raymond struggled with anger. Years of survival instinct had carved it deep into his bones. He snapped easily, retreated quickly, shut down often. But he tried. He attended counseling. He took odd jobs. He avoided the old corners where trouble still lived. And then one afternoon in Harlem, he saw a mural of 5 silhouettes painted across a brick wall. Underneath were the words, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds." Raymond stared at it for a long time. A seed. Was that what he was? Something that could grow despite the darkness? For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future, not defined by the past but rewritten by his own hands. Antron wrestled with a deeper wound. He had lost trust in the system, in life, in himself. But slowly, he built routines. He took walks in the park, even though the sight of trees at night made his chest tighten. He learned to breathe again, learned to recognize peace, not as a distant dream, but as a daily choice. One morning, he saw a group of children playing basketball. Their laughter filled the air, free and unburdened. Antron watched them, realizing how much he had lost but also how much he could still gain. He stepped onto the court. The children stared, wide-eyed. "Can I play?" he asked. They nodded. And as the ball bounced between them, Antron felt a small, fragile thread of humanity knitting itself back into him. Youssef embraced purpose. He spoke at schools, at community centers, to anyone willing to listen. He told young men of color that their lives mattered, that they had value, that they deserved justice and respect. At first, his voice shook. Public speaking wasn't easy, but each time he told his story, he felt lighter, stronger. People listened, really listened. Some cried, some hugged him, some whispered, "You saved me." Yusuf realized that survival had given him a gift, the ability to guide others away from the darkness he had known. He found meaning in the very pain that once threatened to destroy him. Corey, however, struggled to live outside the rhythm of prison life. The world moved too fast. People talked too loud. Doors felt too open. Silence felt too strange. He had nightmares long. Violent flashbacks that dragged him back into the hostile corridors he had worked so hard to leave behind. Some nights he woke up gasping, hands trembling. His mother would sit with him, holding his hands, whispering prayers. One day, Corey visited the site of the old Audubon ballroom, where Malcolm X had been shot. He stood in front of the spot where the man fell and felt an unexpected sense of connection to struggle, to resilience, to the idea that even the broken could rise. Corey exhaled slowly, letting years of pain drain from his lungs. It was the first time he felt himself just beginning to heal. And then came the settlement. The city finally acknowledged its wrongdoing. The number was large, historic, even, but money was never the point. The point was validation, recognition, truth. The point was to stamp in ink what the five had always known: they were innocent. But the true transformation happened not in courtrooms or city hall meetings, but in private moments. The night Kevin played the violin again and realized he could still create beauty. The moment Raymond decided he deserved peace, not punishment. The walk Antron took where he finally breathed without flinching. The speech Youssef delivered where he saw hope reflected in a student's eyes. The night Corey slept without fear. They were not just exonerated, they were reborn. Yet their story was not only about pain, it was about the impossible strength of a human spirit that refuses to die. It was about rising after being buried. It was about 5 boys the world tried to destroy, who grew into men the world now looks to for inspiration. Their story traveled. It traveled to classrooms, to courtrooms, to documentaries, to the screens of millions. People cried for them. People learned from them. People were changed by them. But the story, the real story, was not the tragedy. It was the rebirth. Because the Central Park Five did not simply survive injustice, they transformed it, turned it into purpose, turned it into truth, turned it into a beacon for those still fighting to be heard. Their journey was not over. It was only just beginning. There is a strange quality to life after catastrophe, a soft trembling that lingers beneath the surface, even on quiet days, even when laughter returns. For the 5 men who once were boys swallowed by a system too large and too cruel, the trembling never completely disappeared. It became part of them, woven into the fabric of their identities, shaping the way they walked through the world. But what they did with that trembling, how they carried it, transformed it, learned to live with it rather than under it, that was where their real story began. In the months after their exoneration, they found themselves learning how to be alive again. Not simply living, but being alive, awake, present, aware, trying to understand who they were now that freedom had settled on their shoulders like a tentative bird, unsure if it could trust their hands. Kevin Richardson discovered that freedom was quieter than he expected. Some days he would sit by the window in his family's apartment, watching cars glide down the street, listening to the faint hum of New York practicing its usual chaos. He was no longer trapped, but he felt suspended, floating between the life that was taken from him and the life he was trying to build. His violin became his anchor. Each night, he played not for an audience, not for approval, but for himself. The notes carried his pain and his hope in equal measure. Sometimes when he played, he imagined his younger self sitting across from him, legs crossed, eyes wide, eager to learn. Kevin would think, "I'm sorry, you never got to grow the way you deserved." But as the music filled the room, he also whispered, "I'm here now. I'm still here." Raymond Santana moved through Harlem with a cautious gaze. He noticed every shadow, every alley, every person who glanced at him too long. Years in confinement had sharpened his senses, and though he was free, part of him was always alert. But he was also determined to reclaim his home, to walk streets that once felt like dangers but were now, slowly, becoming part of his healing. One afternoon, he visited a community center where he had spent time as a child. The building looked smaller than he remembered. The paint peeling, the basketball hoops rusted. He walked inside anyway. A group of teenagers turned to look at him. Some recognized him not as a headline, but as a man who had survived. "That's him," one whispered. Raymond took a breath and smiled slightly. Not a big smile, he wasn't ready for that. But enough. enough to show them he wasn't running from his past anymore. Antron McCrae struggled with the idea of rebuilding trust. His relationship with his father had never recovered from the interrogation room. The wound between them was deep, raw, and complicated. His father apologized over and over, with a desperation that bordered on self-punishment. But Antron wasn't sure forgiveness was something he could hand over like a gift. Some days, he wanted to reach for his father's hand and tell him everything would be okay. Other days, he felt a storm brewing in his chest, reminding him of the betrayal that had altered the course of his life. So he kept distance not out of cruelty, but out of self-protection. He went to therapy, quietly, privately, sitting in a small room with a stranger who asked gentle questions. Antron didn't talk much at first, but little by little, he found words. He found a way to untangle the grief he carried like a knot in his stomach. He found the courage to say aloud, "I deserved better." The world outside didn't hear it, but he did, and that was enough to begin healing. Yusef Salam threw himself into purpose. His exoneration had given him a voice, and he refused to waste it. He spoke to students who looked like him, who lived where he had lived, who were at risk of slipping through the cracks the way he once did. He talked about faith, about resilience, about truth. He talked about the night that changed his life, not with bitterness but with clarity. People asked him how he could be so calm, so grounded. Yusef would smile and say, "Because anger is a cage too, and I've already spent enough time behind bars." But what he didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he was still afraid sometimes. Afraid of failing, afraid of not healing enough, afraid of the future. Yet he walked forward anyway. And that courage, the kind that exists despite fear, became his compass. But Corey's path was the hardest, the darkest, the slowest. Being free didn't mean being healed. Sometimes he walked into stores and flinched when someone stepped too close behind him. Sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night, gasping, expecting to see the fluorescent glow of a prison hallway outside his bedroom door. Other times, he sat in complete silence, staring at the wall, unable to move under the weight of memories that refused to fade. People treated him like a hero, like a symbol. They said, "You're so strong." They said, "You survived what no one else could." But Corey knew that survival had come at a cost. He carried scars on his body and deeper scars inside his mind. Still, he refused to give up. His mother encouraged him every day, her voice steady, her presence unwavering. "Just take one step," she said. "One step at a time, baby." And Corey did. Some days the step was small, like walking to the corner store without panicking. Other days it was bigger, like talking to a group of teenagers about perseverance. And slowly, like the first soft green shoot breaking through concrete, Corey began to grow. The five men drifted in and out of each other's lives like constellations separate, but bound by an invisible thread. They shared something no one else could understand, and even when they didn't speak for weeks, their hearts were tied together. Occasionally they met for dinner, for conversation, for silence. The first time they gathered after their exoneration, they sat around a table at a small restaurant in Harlem. The waiter asked what brought them together. Raymond laughed a real laugh this time and said, "Life did." They ate quietly at first, overwhelmed by the reality of sitting together as free men. Then the stories came, memories of prison, of pain, of survival. They didn't relive the trauma. They released it. They placed their burdens on the table beside the food and let themselves be five boys again, if only for a moment. As months turned into years, their story grew larger than themselves. Documentaries were made. Journalists wrote about them. Teachers assigned essays about justice using their case. Young people wore shirts with their names on them, chanting, "They matter." Mothers told their sons, "Look at them. Look at how they rose." But fame was never their goal. Each of them wanted something simpler: healing, purpose, peace. Kevin used part of the settlement to build programs for young musicians. He visited schools, holding violins in his hands, telling children that music could save them in ways the world didn't always understand. He taught them that art wasn't just about talent, it was about survival. One day, a little girl with braids asked him, "Did music save you?" Kevin paused, smiled gently, and answered, It kept me alive. And when she played her first shaky scale, he felt tears sting his eyes, knowing the cycle of pain could end with beauty. Raymond created initiatives for incarcerated youth, determined to break the chains before they wrapped around another generation. He once stood in front of a group of children in a detention center, kids who looked at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "I was one of you once," he told them. "But I shouldn't have been, and you shouldn't be here either." One boy asked him if he hated the police. Raymond sighed. "I hate what they did to me," he said. "But I don't want hate to live in me. Hate is poison, and I'm trying to heal." The boy nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. Antron found family. True family. He married, had children. The sound of their laughter filled the spaces in his heart that prison had hollowed out. He watched them grow, their small hands reaching for him with trust so pure it hurt. Sometimes he sat on the couch at night watching them sleep, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of being there. Not incarcerated, not lost. Present. He promised himself he would be the father he never got to have, consistent, compassionate, patient, and though the scars of his past still throbbed sometimes, he learned to live with them instead of trying to erase them. Youssef transformed into a leader. His voice became a beacon for social justice, echoing across stages that once seemed unimaginable. He spoke to crowds of thousands, his calm presence filling arenas. He wasn't preaching anger, he was preaching transformation, compassion, awareness. People listened. People changed. At one event, a young man approached him, tears in his eyes, and said, "You saved my life. I was going down the wrong path. Your story stopped me." Youssef placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and whispered, "Your life is yours to shape. Don't let the world decide it for you." And in that moment, he realized his suffering had become someone else's salvation. Corey, slowest to heal, became the heart of the movement without even meaning to. His story, raw, brutal, honest, touched people in ways words couldn't describe. A filmmaker once asked him why he didn't smile much. Corey replied quietly, "Smiling feels like a promise. I'm still learning how to make promises to myself." But then one afternoon, at a community event, a little girl ran up to him, hugged his leg, and said, "You're my hero." Something in Corey cracked open. He crouched down, looked into her bright eyes, and for the first time in years, he let himself truly smile. Not a forced one, not a guarded one, but a real, gentle, hopeful smile. The kind that said, "I'm healing." Time continued its unyielding march. Seasons shifted. The city changed again. Some dreams bloomed. Others died quietly. But through it all, the five men kept walking forward, not as victims, not as symbols, but as human beings transformed by grief and grace. And somewhere in the vastness of New York, in the rustle of leaves in Central Park, in the hum of Harlem streets, in the distant echo of sirens, their story lived on. Not as a tragedy, but as a testament to endurance, a testament to resilience, a testament to the unstoppable force of truth, a testament to the idea that even when the world tries to break you, even when it buries you beneath lies and fear, you can rise. Not the same, not untouched, but stronger, brighter, more human. And the five men who walked out of darkness together would go on to light paths for generations who needed to know that suffering is not the end, and justice, even delayed, can still build miracles. Their story was not finished. It was still unfolding. And the world was finally listening. Years after their release, the city had begun to reshape its understanding of them. The Central Park Five were no longer the nameless faces the media once portrayed in grainy black and white mugshots. They had become living proof of a truth the world didn't want to ignore any longer. But rising into the public eye didn't erase the private storms each of them carried. Healing was not a straight line, it was a winding path, sometimes bright, sometimes shadowed, always demanding more strength than anyone should ever have to give. Still, life has a way of offering unexpected bridges to restore the parts of us we thought were forever broken. For Kevin Richardson, that bridge arrived in the form of his daughter. He hadn't planned on fatherhood. The idea frightened him, loving something so deeply when the world had once stolen everything he loved. But when he held the newborn in his arms, tiny and warm and unscarred by injustice, something inside him softened. Her small fingers curled around his thumb with the innocent certainty that he belonged in her world. In that moment, Kevin realized that parenthood wasn't about being fearless. It was about learning to grow even after being uprooted. As she grew older, she loved hearing him play the violin. Each time he drew the bow across the strings, she would sway, giggle, and clap her hands. Kevin played harder, not for fame or redemption, but to fill her childhood with the music he never got to keep. When she asked him one day, "Daddy, why do you close your eyes when you play?" he answered truthfully, "Because, in remembering who I am." Her smile became his forgiveness. Her existence became his second chance. Raymond Santana found himself at war with the world in subtler ways. Even after freedom, he learned that people were complicated. Some greeted him with admiration, others with suspicion they tried to disguise as curiosity. It was the kind of tension that could pull a man apart if he let it. But Raymond refused to be defined by strangers, assumptions, or old wounds. He started attending community meetings, speaking with kids on the verge of slipping into trouble, not from a pedestal but from lived experience. One evening, after a long talk with a group of teenagers, one boy lingered behind. He had a scar above his eyebrow, eyes too old for his age, and the hesitant posture of someone who had been disappointed too many times. "Mr. Santana," he whispered, "do you think someone like me can change?" Raymond looked at him carefully, recognizing a shadow of the boy he once was misunderstood, underestimated, aching to be seen beyond his mistakes. "You already have," Raymond replied. "You asked the question." The boy blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the answer. Raymond placed a hand on his shoulder. "Change doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in 1,000 small choices. Make the next one a good one." That night, Raymond walked home slower than usual. He felt the cold breeze brushing against him, like a reminder that even the broken pieces of his past had the power to build something meaningful. Antron McCrae discovered that healing sometimes comes not from solitude, but from connection. His children had become his universe. But there were still wounds he hadn't faced. One summer afternoon, he found himself standing outside his father's old house. He hadn't visited in years. The memories were too heavy: the night of the interrogation, the betrayal, the silence that followed. But something had shifted in Antron. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past. Maybe it was about freeing himself from carrying its weight. He knocked. His father opened the door, older, fragile, the years having carved lines of regret into his face. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence felt like 1,000 apologies tangled between them. Finally, Antron said quietly, "Can I come in?" His father nodded, stepping aside without a word. They sat on the old couch, the air tense but not hostile. His father tried to speak, but emotion trapped his voice. When he finally whispered, "I'm sorry," it was with a pain so raw that Antron felt something inside him soften. He didn't forgive instantly. He didn't forget, but he saw the man in front of him flawed, breaking, trying. And for the first time, he realized that both of them had been victims of fear that night. Fear manipulated by a system designed to exploit weakness. It wasn't closure, but it was a beginning. Meanwhile, Yusef Salam traveled across the country, speaking in cities he once only knew from maps. His story resonated deeply, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to resilience. After one of his speeches, a woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. She had a son serving time for a crime he didn't commit. "How do I help him stay strong?" she asked. Yusef took her hands gently, feeling her trembling. "Tell him this," he said. "The walls around him cannot hold his mind unless he lets them. Remind him that truth doesn't disappear just because someone buries it." She sobbed softly, repeating his words as if memorizing them for her next visit to her son. Yusef walked away from the conversation with a familiar ache. The ache of knowing that injustice was not just a memory, but a living, breathing reality for too many. But he also felt purpose, sharper than ever. The five had survived a nightmare, now they were teaching others how to fight theirs. But Corey's healing came quietly, slowly, inch by inch. He attended therapy, though it took months before he spoke more than a few words. He went on long walks, finding comfort in movement. Sometimes he wandered through the city, listening to the rhythm of life, People chatting on street corners, trains rumbling underground, sirens wailing in the distance. The world was loud, but in its noise, Corey found a strange kind of peace. Noise meant life. Noise meant freedom. One crisp autumn morning, Corey visited Central Park for the first time since that night. He stood at the edge of the woods where everything had changed, where innocence had been stolen, where fear had been born. The breeze rustled through the leaves, whispering memories he didn't want to remember. His heart hammered, his hands shaking slightly. The shadows between the trees looked too familiar, too close, too dangerous. But Corey didn't run. He stepped forward. One step, then another. He let the memories come, the fear, the confusion, the betrayal, and then he let them drift away like leaves carried by the wind. Standing among the trees, Corey whispered into the quiet, "You don't own me anymore." And for the first time since he was 16, he felt the earth beneath his feet as his ground, not the scene of a crime he didn't commit. Later, when he told the others about his visit, they listened with the kind of silence only those who shared trauma could understand. Kevin wiped a tear. Raymond nodded, jaw tight. Antron inhaled deeply. Yusef placed a hand on Corey's back, grounding him. None of them said, "We're proud of you." They didn't need to. The strength in Corey's voice said everything. As time passed, the five men began to find peace, not only in their individual lives, but in their bond. They met often in restaurants, in parks, in living rooms. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply existed in the same space, the quiet between them carrying more meaning than words ever could. Trauma had made them brothers. Healing kept them close. Then came a moment none of them expected. A call from a young filmmaker named Ava, who wanted to bring their story to the screen. Not as a documentary, but as a series raw, human, honest. At first, they hesitated. Reopening old wounds meant exposing themselves again. But Ava promised something different. "I'm not telling the story of what happened to you," she said. "I'm telling the story of who you are." And somehow, that changed everything. They agreed. In the months that followed, they worked closely with the production team, sharing memories they had buried, reliving days that once made their hearts race with fear. The process was painful. Kevin had nightmares. Raymond became withdrawn. Antron cried during a reenactment of the interrogation scene. Yusef had moments where he stared into the distance, lost in a memory he didn't want to revisit. Corey walked off set more than once, overwhelmed, but they kept going. Because this time, the world wasn't misrepresenting them. This time, they were telling the truth. When the series finally premiered, the world changed. People cried. People apologized. People protested. People learned. The five watched it separately, at first needing space, needing air. But later, they watched it together, sitting in a small living room, the screen glowing in front of them. There were moments when one of them would reach out and silently hold another's hand. Moments when they paused the show and sat quietly, processing the weight of seeing their younger selves being broken on screen. Moments when tears came without warning. When the final episode ended, none of them spoke. The air felt thick with emotion. Finally, Raymond whispered, "We survived." Antron nodded, tears streaking his cheeks. Yusef exhaled slowly, eyes glistening. Kevin placed a hand over his heart. Corey whispered, "We made it out." But survival wasn't the end. It was the foundation. Over the years that followed, they became symbols of reform, advocates for justice, voices for the voiceless. They walked into courtrooms, classrooms, legislative chambers. They met presidents. They changed laws. They saved lives. They healed countless others, simply by showing that healing was possible. People called them the Exonerated Five. Now a title reclaimed, renewed, but when they were alone together, when the world wasn't watching, they were simply five men who had walked through hell and found each other on the other side. Five men who knew grief intimately, but resilience even more deeply. Five men who refused to let injustice define the rest of their lives. And even as they continued moving forward, building families, building futures, building hope, they carried the memory of the boys they once were. Not with sorrow, not with regret, but with love. Because those boys had endured the unimaginable so that the men could become extraordinary. And their story was still being written. Healing is rarely loud. It's rarely dramatic. More often, it slips into your life quietly, like a soft light pressing through blinds at dawn. For the Exonerated Five, healing arrived not in sudden epiphanies, but in small, almost invisible moments, moments that stitched themselves into strength over time. Kevin Richardson felt the shift one morning in early spring. He had woken up before sunrise, not because of nightmares this time, but because of the soft weight of his daughter curled against his chest. Her tiny breaths brushed his skin like the gentlest promise. He lay there listening to her, feeling her heartbeat sync with his. Something inside him loosened, something head held tight for years. When she opened her eyes and said, "Daddy, you look happy." Happiness felt strange, fragile, new, but it was real. Later that day, Kevin met a group of young musicians at a community center. They gathered around him with instruments nearly too big for their hands. When one boy struggled with the bow, Kevin knelt, guiding him gently. As they created music together, messy, imperfect, beautiful, Kevin realized that this was his path. His suffering wasn't erased, but it had transformed into empathy, precision, and purpose. He could teach kids what the world had tried to take from him: the ability to dream without fear. Raymond Santana found his turning point in a bookstore in Queens. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering between aisles, trailing his fingers along the spines of books, letting titles whisper their stories. Then he saw something that made him freeze. A young girl, maybe 14, sat cross-legged on the floor reading a thick paperback. She had the same age, the same innocence he once had before everything went wrong. She looked up at him and smiled a soft smile, curious and open. "Are you Raymond Santana?" she asked. He blinked, surprised. "Yeah, that's me. I watched the series," she said shyly. "My teacher showed it to us. It changed the way I see things. Thank you for sharing your story." Raymond didn't know what to say. He had spent so many years convinced the world didn't want to hear him, that his voice was too small, too damaged. Yet here was this young girl, whose eyes reflected admiration instead of judgment. When she said, "You helped me understand the importance of fairness," Raymond felt something heal inside him. An invisible wound he hadn't realized was still aching. He walked out of the bookstore, into the bright afternoon, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the world might finally be wide enough for him. For Antron McCrae, the moment came unexpectedly on a rainy evening. The house was quiet, his kids tucked into bed, the sound of raindrops tapping gently against the windows. He had spent years trying to piece together the fragments of himself. Years in therapy. Years learning to trust again. He walked through the living room, turning off lights, then paused by the hallway mirror. He looked at his reflection, not the boy who had been broken in a police interrogation room, not the angry young man who had carried betrayal like an iron weight, but the man he had become: a father, a husband, a survivor. Antron approached the mirror slowly. He placed his hand against the glass, palm meeting its cold surface. "You made it," he whispered to the reflection. His voice trembled. "You survived." He had never said those words aloud before, never allowed himself to acknowledge that survival itself was an accomplishment, a miracle earned through years of pain and perseverance. Tears slid down his cheeks, not from sadness, but from release long overdue, long suppressed. For the first time, he saw not the loss, but the strength. Yusef Salam experienced his transformation on a stage in Atlanta. The auditorium was filled with students, teachers, activists, parents. A buzz of anticipation filled the room. Yusef stood backstage, hands folded, eyes closed. He had given dozens of talks before, but something about this crowd felt different, heavy with expectation, hungry for guidance. When he stepped out into the light, the room erupted in applause, but Yusef didn't smile. He breathed deeply, grounding himself. Then he began to speak not about injustice, though injustice was the foundation of his story, but about possibility. "You are the authors of your own lives," he told them. "The world will try to write your story for you. It will try to define you before you define yourself. Don't let it. Don't ever hand your pen to someone else." As he spoke, he saw faces softening, hearts opening. He saw young men straightening their backs, young women wiping tears. He saw hope blooming in real time. When he finished, the entire auditorium rose to their feet. Students rushed toward him afterward, asking questions, seeking advice, offering gratitude. But one girl, a quiet, shy girl who waited until everyone else had left, approached him trembling. "They told me I wouldn't become anything," she whispered. "But after hearing you, I think they might be wrong." Yusuf placed a hand over his heart and said softly, "They were wrong before they even spoke." That night, walking back to his hotel under the glow of streetlights, Yusuf realized his pain had finally found its purpose. His suffering had become a lighthouse, guiding others through their storms. But Corey's turning point arrived not with applause or recognition, but in silence. He was visiting a trauma center in Brooklyn, a place that offered therapy and support to victims of violence and wrongful imprisonment. He didn't go there often. It was still hard for him to sit in rooms where stories of pain spilled so easily. But he went this time because a counselor he trusted insisted it might help. A small group had gathered 5 or 6 men, most around Corey's age. They sat in a circle, shoulders tense, expressions guarded. Corey took a seat quietly, avoiding eye contact. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Then one man spoke. His voice was rough, like it had cracked too many times. "I don't know how to live out here," he confessed. "I've been home for 6 months, but I don't sleep. I don't trust anyone. I don't know who I am anymore." Corey inhaled sharply. The words hit him like a memory familiar, suffocating. Another man nodded. "People say I'm free, but I feel trapped. I can't stop looking over my shoulder." Corey's chest tightened. He placed his hands on his knees, grounding himself. Then the counselor looked at Corey gently, asking, "Would you like to share anything?" For a long moment, Corey couldn't speak. His throat felt tight. His palms were sweating. He thought about saying no. He thought about standing up and leaving. But something kept him there. He took a shaky breath and said quietly, "I understand." The room stilled. Corey lifted his gaze slightly, meeting their eyes for the first time. "I know what it feels like to come home and still feel like you're inside," he said. "I know what it's like to flinch at shadows, to hear echoes of things you survived, to feel like the world is too loud, too fast, too much." The men listened, really listened. "I didn't know how to live at first," Corey continued. "I didn't know if I even deserved to. But I learned one thing. Healing isn't something you do alone." His voice cracked. "But it's possible." Silence followed, but it was a different silence now. Not heavy, not painful. Shared. Understood. After the session, one of the men approached Corey with tears in his eyes. "You helped me today," he whispered. "I thought I was the only one who felt like this." Corey swallowed hard. "You're not alone," he said. "None of us are." Walking home that evening, Corey realized something profound. He wasn't just healing, he was helping others heal, and that gave him a strength he never knew he possessed. As the years passed, the 5 men continued to grow in ways that surprised even them. Their lives expanded beyond the boundaries of their trauma. They built families, careers, friendships. They learned to laugh without flinching, to dream without doubting, to live without apologizing. Their story became required viewing in classrooms, a catalyst for reform, a reminder of the cost of prejudice and the power of truth. Strangers approached them, not with pity, but with gratitude. Young activists carried their names on posters. Lawmakers cited their experience when pushing for criminal justice reforms. They were no longer the Central Park Five. They were the Exonerated Five. They were leaders. They were symbols. They were hope. But most importantly, they were free. We see Los 17. They were free, one of the men in 17, in ways deeper, fuller, and more profound than the day they walked out of prison. Because freedom is not just walking through open doors. Freedom is walking forward without fear. Freedom is reclaiming your voice. Freedom is discovering who you are beyond your scars. And each of them, in their own way, had done just that. Their story wasn't finished. It was still unfolding, still growing, still inspiring, still teaching the world that even the deepest injustices cannot extinguish the human spirit. And somewhere in New York, beneath the shifting shadows of Central Park, a breeze carried their strength across the grass, whispering to the world, "We were broken, but we rose. We were silenced, but we speak. We were buried, but we grew.